We can know, think, and understand a great deal, but that which is not in harmony with our love, we will cast away. The first thing I think of when I read that is a very trivial example that I do not care one iota about football, so as many times as you would describe to me the rules of the game, I just will not hold on to that information because I have no room in my brain for it. But this statement, of course, speaks to something more than just my dismissal of the rules of football. This statement focuses on how important our love is to defining our life, our capacity to love. It is this which is the central defining part of our being, of our spiritual being, of our natural being. And it defines all that we will take into our minds and hearts, all that we will do. So you could say that expanding our capacity to love is at the heart of the spiritual path. I would guess this is true for many of the world's religious traditions, that they would say this is why we come to church, why we go to synagogue, why we gather in prayer. While we're all born with the capacity to love ourselves, and if you have a 2-year-old, you know that that's true, it takes some work to expand this love. There's a learning curve, a process that we have to undergo if we are to begin loving outside of ourselves, loving other people, and not only as a response to them loving us. This process is what we call here regeneration, or being born again in the Spirit. It's the process of recognizing that love itself is not something that we create or own, but a force of life that we are gifted, that flows through us to the extent that we allow it to, that flows through us to the extent that we are willing to receive, and perhaps more importantly, to the willingness that we have to express that love for the betterment of others, for the betterment of our greater world. I might ask, as you gather here in the sanctuary this morning, do you have a sense of your capacity for love? High? Low? Somewhere in the middle? My guess is you may have some sense of this, but we're probably not the most accurate assessors of ourselves. Seeing ourselves totally clearly is a difficult, if not impossible, task. My guess is that for some of you, you may have some objectivity about thinking of yourself from the past to today. I know that I can certainly see the difference between who I was in my teens and 20s and who I am today. If I was still as caught up in all of the self-referential thinking that defined my days in my teenage years, I would not nearly be able to complete the tasks at hand for life in my 40s. So I've made a little bit of progress. But this snapshot of where I am is hardly the full picture. I know one of the challenges for me in thinking about my capacity to love is I often associate love with positive feelings, feelings of joy, contentment, peace. And yet, if I look at my days today compared to my days in my teenage years and 20s, I don't know if I necessarily have extended much more capacity for joy or peace today. Sometimes it feels like my life is a lot more challenging today than it was back then. But I don't know if this is what defines love. I think the reality is that growing in love has really very little to do with joy and peace and contentment. That when we are fully regenerated and completely open to heaven, yes, it will be joyful, it will be peaceful, we will have a contentment about us. But in the meantime, between our completely unregenerate self and our totally regenerate self, there's a whole lot of space in there for love looking a lot more like heartache, like tough love, the pain of expressing our love in a world that doesn't want to hear it or receive it. That love, in fact, in our day-to-day life is wrapped up in difficult choices, in weighing our own needs and the needs of others, the needs of the world at large. Love is acting in the world in line with God's higher purpose, with providence, and that higher purpose is realized not by floating high above the cares of the world, but by getting into the fray and the work and the mess. Much of the Bible is about how God's call, how the path of love is at odds with the current culture of the time. That path of love is this lonely voice in the midst of chaos. It's the lone prophet Ezekiel that we heard this morning being called to go to the Israelites and declare their transgressions. What a fun job that must have been. It's Jesus being rejected by those from his hometown, those who he grew up with. And it's the disciples traveling off 2 by 2 to share the good news, knowing that they will often be refused and have to turn around and shake the dust off of their feet. Growing in our capacity to love, growing that love that defines us, that defines how much we receive and how much we will have to share, is very much about being willing to change and grow and listen, to hear the prophets at that most internal of places. When I think about my capacity to love and the way we associate love with the heart, it just makes so much sense. I want to just touch my chest when I think about what is my capacity to love. Because love is that the love that inspires our lives is very internal. It's at the deepest part of us. Our love is not defined by how many hugs we give or how many cards we send. It's about this spot in our hearts that shapes our lives. Our internal being resides on a spiritual level somewhere deep inside. This is where we get to the heart of things, where we answer the question, why am I doing what I am doing? And it is here that the smallest, tiniest change, tiniest expansion towards God, towards the good, can have vast and rippling effects into our lives. But simultaneously, I will note that the tiniest of changes, the tiniest of expansions, can be hugely painful and disorienting. But this, my friends, is why we are here on this planet. I want to read something from Swedenborg's Arcana Celestia that points to this. He says, heaven resides with a person in the inner self, thus in the person's thought and intentions, and then from these in the outer self, that is in the person's words and actions, but not in the outer self without the inner. For all hypocrites know how to say the right things and do the right things, but they are incapable of right thinking or of having right intentions. By right thinking and right intentions spring forth the love of good and a belief in what is true. Right now, some of you know that we're working on this project here at the chapel to cast forth a huge vision to create a new center here in the name of Helen Keller, one of the great saints of our tradition. And these last few weeks, I have been spending an inordinate amount of time trying to come up with the 12 words that will define the mission of this endeavor. Me and several other people have been throwing back and forth different words and phrases and ideas to think about what is the mission of this place. And we're spending this much time on these 12 words, or however many words it's going to be, because we know that this is our central intention. This is the thing that will shape everything that comes about in this new place. Now, this is not to say that if we get the perfect statement and the perfect 12 words, then everything, of course, will go perfectly smoothly and right and easily, and there'll be no trouble along the way. But we know how important it is to start in the right place. So I wonder what place you are starting from today. I've been thinking a lot about this. What is my mission statement? What is the central intention of my being? And does the course of my life need a little bit of tweaking? I spend a lot of times trying to tweak my schedule and trying to tweak the commitments that I have, to try to sort out my life and make it, a little more manageable. And this is useful and helpful. But I would argue that it's tweaking that central purpose and direction in which we are traveling that has the greatest impact. This is where we have a little bit of control. Because as you all know, outcomes we have very little control over. And we can also ask this question of the church. What is our central intention as a community? What did it begin as? Where is it today? And is this the intention that is of the highest use for the glory of God and for the glory of this place? Is our intention pointed towards expansion and growth, growing in our capacity to love? Or has it fallen a bit into retraction and self-preservation? I see this in the movement of the church all around the world, because we know churches are formed by human beings. And while they nearly always begin with this highest expression of hope and faith in God, this belief in the selfless expression of love, churches and organizations run by human beings inevitably fall into slipping into a focus more on self-centered love. Church that's formed for the glory of God can quickly become populated with people who, instead of loving God first, love the church first, and the church as they understand it to be. These buildings, these rituals, they can become idols, getting in the way of the higher love that they were created to look to. And I believe that this pattern does not just happen in churches, but everywhere. Church buildings and practices can become idols. In our family lives, a clean home or a good report card from our children could become idols. Anytime we look to anything concrete as a measure of our love, we will start to see that our intentions have become too small. Focus not on the great love that God promises, but on the earthly measuring sticks that will never be enough, that will never reach the heights of love that we are invited to. How we set these intentions, the direction to which we are seeking life, in my estimation, is the most defining factor of our lives. And religious traditions and churches have sought to be places and schools of thought that help us to set these intentions, to help us to look to higher purpose as we set those intentions, that we live not just to please our parents or ourselves or our peers, that we live not just to get the most toys or things, the most esteem or praise, but that we live for the purpose of expanding our capacity to love as individuals and as a community. This is what all of the world's traditions have been professing in all of their imperfect ways. This is what our community professes. And in this way, the Lord always provides a church, a meeting place between this high ideals of God and the imperfect human beings that we are. And simultaneously, this church must always be changing. This is a very challenging task, as churches seek to bring forward the history and the wisdom of the past, while also embracing and being open to the prophets of the future. This is exhausting and mind-boggling. It can be overwhelming. It was in those scripture readings that we read this morning of the prophets, of Jesus himself, of the disciples, being those lone speakers in a chaotic world. But my friends, this is why we are here. Sifting through all of it, sifting through all of the imperfection of how this love has been communicated from the past, and listening for how it is being communicated now. This is what resurrection is about: death and new life. And at the very core, for all of us and for our world, is growing in love. So wherever you are on the path this morning, I invite you to consider if you're holding on to a measuring stick of what love looks like that might be a little bit too small. I invite you to think about where you might be challenged to open up, to expand just a little bit. And I invite you to consider that that expansion will feel uncomfortable. And it probably means embracing something you have yet to embrace. This is why we are here. This is why we are here, born into the world. This is why we are here in this sanctuary. Let us do the work to love even when it hurts. And it is this love that will last. Amen.